Okay, welcome everyone to the SIP seminar. It's a pleasure to have Professor Laura Balzano here to give us a talk on finding low-dimensional structure in messy data. Laura is a friend of mine, and we were former colleagues, and it's a pleasure to have her finally come to Rutgers and tell us the exciting work she's doing. In terms of background, Laura is an associate professor in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Science Department at the University of Michigan. She got her bachelor's from Rice University, master's from UCLA, and PhD from Wisconsin. And then I guess the love of Midwest kept her at Michigan. She has won a number of awards in her career. In particular, she has 3 Young Investigator Awards to her name, including the NSF Career Award, the ARO Young Investigator Award, and the Air Force Young Investigator Award. She also has faculty fellowships from Intel and 3M. And she has won also the Vulcan's Education Excellence Award at the University of Michigan. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Professor Balzano to tell us her work on finding low-dimensional structure in messy data. Laura, all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Wahid. And thank you, everyone, for coming. It's a pleasure to be able to present to you. So yes, my talk today is going to focus on a couple of different works that I have done recently on finding low-dimensional structure in messy data. When I talk about messy data, I am referring to many, wide variety of challenges that we see in real data problems. Okay, so for example, in power systems measurements, we see a high degree of heterogeneity of timescales and spatial scales. In medical imaging, when you look at a lot of historical data, you'll get images collected at different radiation levels from different types of machines. Or in computer vision, for example, if you're looking at features in images, like in this illustration in the bottom center of this slide, then in certain frames, some of those features are obstructed by a moving vehicle or something else that's in between the camera and the feature of interest. So, there's a wide variety of ways that messy data challenges may come in to the problem. And the good news is, well, in the first place, in all of these applications, we're collecting this data because we believe there's some kind of structure from which we can learn or, estimate model parameters, okay? So the focus of the research in my lab is to say, well, if we think there's some structure that helps us do prediction and learning, maybe we can also use that same structure to handle these messy data challenges, to impute missing entries, detect anomalies, and things like that. A great deal of my work and other work in this area has focused on linear low-rank structure, meaning that we believe there's some kind of linear model underlying the data that we observe, and perhaps some additive noise, but typically independent and identically distributed. And what I'm going to talk about today is how do we generalize from those assumptions and still do some interesting things that are useful for applications where maybe the structure isn't exactly low rank, or the noise model is more sophisticated than just IID noise. Okay, so before I get into those generalizations, I just want to start everyone on the same page with the subspace model for matrix data. So this green matrix Y is our data matrix, and a linear model assumes that the columns of Y are well represented by linear combination of some columns of another matrix, this blue matrix, which we'll use U for its notation, okay? This particular decomposition that I've written, the singular value decomposition, then has some positive singular values and some matrix V, which is some people call the weight matrix or the loadings. Basically, they create the linear combinations of the columns of U in order to approximate Y, okay? Now, in a lot of real data, if we look at those singular values, we do see a behavior that shows there's some that are large and many that are very small, or even zero. So these three images here are simply the ordered singular values from these different data sets. So this is a computer network data set, which has bit counts from server to server. This is a temperature data set from an embedded environmental sensor network. And this is a data set of images where each vector in this matrix is one of these images vectorized, okay? And in all the cases, we have some large singular values and then many that are small or near zero. And so the data are pretty well approximated by a linear low-rank subspace. Now, there are two mathematical explanations or let's say formalizations of the singular value decomposition. So on one hand, it's just a decomposition that is exists for any matrix. But on the other hand, it's the solution to two problems. So the first problem is the one that you see here. It's a minimization problem where you try to find a low-rank matrix that best approximates the data in terms of, in this case, the Frobenius norm or any unitarily invariant norm, okay? This, we know, is solved by applying the singular value decomposition, okay? The other mathematical problem that has the SVD as its solution is one that uses a probabilistic model to generate the data. So here you assume your data Y is generated from that low-rank subspace U with some coefficients and additive noise. In this model, those coefficients are Gaussian and the additive noise is also Gaussian, okay, and identically distributed. And if you make this assumption, then the SVD of the covariance matrix, YY transpose, gives you the maximum likelihood estimator for that subspace and also the singular values, okay? And so the SVD, is on one hand a matrix decomposition, and then on the other hand, the solution to these two interesting model formulations of different problems we might see. Okay. Now, if we wanted to generalize the two problems that I just mentioned, we can imagine a lot of things we might want to do. We might want to use different coefficient and noise models other than Gaussian in the last example. We might want to use a loss function that's not a unitarily invariant norm, as the Frobenius norm was in the first example. Okay, we may want to have, impose that there's some missing data, or that the sensors may lose calibration and have some function through which you're observing the measurements. Okay, so this is just a variety of different ways that people have been working on generalizing the problems that I mentioned, but the singular value decomposition doesn't solve these problems anymore. Okay, so when we see that maybe there's not an obvious way to extend the SVD into these contexts, instead we turn to optimization and try to find, optimization algorithms that can minimize the loss under some constraints that try to capture these different generalizations we're interested in. Now, I put a star here next to this statement because Actually, it's not always obvious that SVD computations and optimization methods are completely distinct. In some cases, you're actually doing very similar processing and very similar iterative steps, okay? And that's a question that's very interesting to me, but in general, we think of them as different things. The SVD is this algorithm that can compute a decomposition, and optimization is, a generic approach to minimizing an objective function under constraints. Okay, so my group has done a lot of work, you could say, probing this framework, thinking about all these different generalizations I mentioned on the previous page. These are a variety of different citations, and today I'm going to talk about two. The first is Heteroskedastic Pca, and what that is changing the additive noise model in probabilistic Pca that I showed before. And the second is something we call variety completion, where we generalize low-rank matrix completion to be in the context where we assume the data are part of a low-dimensional algebraic variety. And you can think of that as some kind of lifting function, and we have a low-rank model in that lifted space. So we'll see a little bit about each one of those problems before the end of the roughly hour, okay? All right. So I'll go to the first problem. Please feel free to stop me if you have any questions about the framework or just any details as I go on. I would like it to be as clear as possible. Okay, so the first problem I'm going to talk about, Heteroskedastic Pca, is one that I worked on with my prior student, David Hong, who's now a postdoc at Wharton Statistics, my current student, Kyle Gilman, and my colleague at Michigan, Jeff Fessler. This problem was motivated first by medical imaging problems and environmental sensing problems, where we had historical data that we wanted to learn from, but the historical data, the different, let's say, columns of a matrix that we wanted to learn from, were each had very different noise applied to them, okay? So for example, in medical imaging, we had historical data, and some scans were at very high radiation levels compared to modern scanners. And so that meant the signal to noise ratio was better. Also in environmental sensing, we often have data sets where some of the sensors are handheld and sort of low quality sensors. The noise on some of those low quality sensors has a very wide variation. But then we have other data from government sensors that are, like permanent sensing devices that are fenced off and cared for on a daily basis. And those are much more accurate. And we wanted to use all of these data together in order to learn a model. We also learned in the meanwhile that there's very similar problems in astrophysics imaging. So the problem, the basic problem that we asked ourselves that I want to illustrate on this slide, if we have a low dimensional model, a low dimensional linear model. So in this case, since I'm in 2 dimensions, my linear model is just a 1-dimensional model, okay? And we observe 2 different sets of data. So in this case, the red dots are, say, high quality sensors that have a very small noise variance. And the blue dots are lower quality sensors that have a very high noise variance. Then the question we asked was, what will Pca do when we apply it to these data? So these are just 2 random instances that I am showing here, okay? And in these particular instances, when we apply PCA, we get these pink lines, okay? So you can see these pink lines are biased away from that original green line, which was the true linear model from which the data were generated. Now, in these two instances, you can see that some of these blue points, despite all being generated from the green line, were sort of biased off in a certain direction in both cases, and that's why the PCA estimate is also biased in that direction. And in general, it's very natural for people who work in these areas to understand that PCA is not a robust estimator. When you have some outlier data points, as you might get from a very high variance sensor, then the PCA estimate won't necessarily be robust, okay? So I'll tell you about two methods, one which is this brownish line and one which is this teal dotted line. And both of those methods do much better at estimating the true underlying linear model because they consider the heteroskedastic sensors, meaning sensors with different noise variants in the model directly. Okay, so to set up the notation, we have samples y1 through yn, so n d-dimensional samples. We put them into this matrix Y, and we assume it's generated from a low-rank model. Again, the components U. I'm going to call this diagonal matrix of positive amplitudes, okay? And then we'll assume there's ID random weights. Then the main difference from other models is that our noise standard deviation will vary from column to column. So we multiply IID random noise epsilon with different noise variances, okay? And what we'll assume is that we have L groups of samples, and we know these groups in advance. And each group has some number of sensors with a given noise variance. So in this illustration over here, we have L equals 2 groups. Some number of them have a very small noise variance, and another number of those sensors have a much higher noise variance. Okay. We're going to take two approaches to this problem. The first is a weighted PCA approach, where we're just going to still solve using the SVD, but we're going to weight each column of the matrix according to some weights that we discover that I'm denoting here with alpha j. We'll weight each cluster of data or each group of data in the same way. So alpha is one of these different L weight values. The other approach we're going to take is to change that probabilistic PCA model to actually consider these different noise variances, A to J, that are different for each group, okay? The benefits of weighted PCA are that we can just use vanilla SVD. We know that for a given weight, it solves the problem exactly. We are able to show some theory, in particular asymptotic recovery results in the high dimensional setting for this approach. But it's not really obvious that weighted PCA is the right approach to this problem. And you'll see that the optimal weights require knowledge or estimates of unknown parameters. And so those are some of the downsides of weighted PCA approach. On the other hand, in our probabilistic PCA formulation, we can use maximum likelihood to incorporate estimates of all the unknown parameters. We have a non-concave problem, but it seems like it has a nice behavior, a nice landscape. We have interesting algorithms without guarantees yet or analysis, and we make these Gaussian distributional assumptions.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes,
Hi, Laura.
please. Hi.
So for the weighted PCA approach, is like naively, would I just sort of make my W1 through WL like some kind of grid and I'm like doing this horrible grid search over like an exponentially large, like a very large number of combinations of alphas, or?
So what we're going to do is we're
Oh,
going
that
to
is to find the best alpha, I guess that's what I mean.
Right. Yes. No, I understand. And I'll tell you what we propose is the best alpha in a minute. Maybe let me just say it like that.
Okay.
So instead of having to do a search like that, we have a suggestion for one to use. Okay, so I'm going to start by telling you about this weighted PCA approach. And like I said, we've done some asymptotic theory for weighted PCA. And in order to give you the sort of context for that, I wanted to tell you about work that, if you're familiar with this area, is very familiar to you, but not familiar to everyone. So in the setting where we have noise, all of the same variance added to the low rank, or what we call spiked covariance model, then we've known for now more than a decade that as we allow the number of samples and the dimension to go to infinity at some fixed ratio, okay, otherwise known as the high dimensional setting, then U hat, which is the principal component estimated by PCA, or the singular value decomposition, will have an inner product with the true underlying component U that goes almost surely to this ratio. Okay, so this ratio is slightly less than 1, but as the signal to noise ratio gets better, or as N over D gets larger, then this will get closer and closer to 1. Okay, so the inner product of your estimate with the true buried or planted component will approach 1.
So what's theta here? Sorry.
Theta was that signal or amplitude, we called it. So these Z's, these Z's are IID, but theta says basically how important each component is, or the signal amplitude of each component.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. So analysis that we did for still vanilla PCA, but with heteroskedastic noise, recovered a very similar model. It's a ratio of rational functions. I'm going to show you in a little more detail what that is in a minute. But it's like very simple to compute in the same way as this, and it does reduce to the homoskedastic case when you do have all the noise variances being the same. So next we want to ask, then how should we choose our weights? So like in this picture where we had 2 different groups, we are going to use a weight for, the data in group 1 with very low noise variance, and then some different weight for the data in group 2. And the question that we tried to address was, how do we choose those weights? We have a variety of different properties of our data, and we ask what choice of weights is the best. And common choices that are very natural are, for example, binary weights, where if data is very, very noisy, we just don't use it in the PCA estimate. Or even more common suggestion is to use whitening. So you just allow the weight to be 1 over the noise variance, which will, of course, more aggressively downweight high variance data. Okay, so we asked, is one of these choices or some other choice of weights optimal in some sense? And in particular, the optimality we decided to consider was to maximize this high dimensional asymptotic recovery number, okay? So in particular, how could we weight the data so that this right-hand side is maximal, okay? And in a couple of slides, I'll give you some motivation for why this is a very reasonable thing to do. I mean, this is an asymptotic recovery guarantee. So somehow you might think that, well, this is only really optimal when you have extremely, large sample size and large dimension. But actually we see concentration at very, very reasonable sample sizes. And so that's why we are motivated to try to maximize this right-hand term. So we're going to choose weights to optimize that recovery term. And these functions here now, I have them written here. They're, like I said, rational functions. They involve things like the number of samples, the ratio of samples to dimension, and then these are the weights, the noise variances, okay? And it's easy to compute. It's not like easy, it's not, or at least we haven't found a way to reduce the form any more than is shown here. But the cool thing is that it's a nice function of W, and so we can actually just also tell you what weights maximize the right-hand side of this asymptotic recovery equation. So here's the theorem that we came up with. We found that the weights that maximize this recovery are given here. So first 1 over the noise variance, but then multiplied by another term, which involves this signal amplitude theta and the noise variance again. So we saw, interestingly, that these optimal weights didn't depend on the samples per dimension or on proportions. Like if you have tons of, very noisy data, it doesn't change the weight that you would use. But they do depend on the subspace amplitude. So that means since, theta I is different for every component, then you have to change the weights in order to recover each component. And they also depend on the additive noise variance, which we expected. So here's another look at this, at these values for the weights. So if you look at it as a function of signal to noise ratio, so this is amplitude to the additive noise, okay, then actually when you have a very good signal to noise ratio, you do use the inverse noise variance for these weights. And when your signal to noise ratio is bad, then you're going to heavily downweight those points, okay? So for us, this was a very interesting result that showed us that people's intuition in both cases is really pretty accurate, that, if you're have a nice signal to noise ratio, inverse noise variance is a very natural thing to do. But if you have extremely noisy data, you almost want to be throwing it away because Pca is not a robust estimator. And so in fact, these weights give you a nice interpolation between those two and tell you exactly what to do at different SNR levels.
Quick question, Laura.
Yeah.
So I guess when we look at it in terms of ratio, it makes sense. But I presume theorem 1 kind of has the equality in it, which sounds like if the component had a lot of strength, theta I went to kind of infinity, it is saying the weight should be 0, or am I reading it wrong? So ratio-wise, it makes sense that you are saying for very large components, the different weights should have the same ratio, but does theorem 1 should have the equality, or should it be like a proportionality kind of a thing?
Yeah, no, proportionality would work perfectly well too. So like, just don't forget that if I'm weighting Pca, let me just show, here, that I can change all of the weights by any constant and the solution is the same.
Okay, right.
So, so that's why, proportionality would be fine here, but equality is also fine in the sense that all of them will be changed by that same proportion. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I also foreshadowed that I would try to convince you that even though we're optimizing this asymptotic equation, that it's a useful and interesting thing to do even for non-asymptotic setting. So in these experiments, synthetic data experiments, we have just two components that we're trying to recover. They have signal amplitudes given here, 25 and 16. And then we observe a small amount of data with noise variance 1 and a large amount of data with noise variance 4. Okay. And in the plot, what you'll see, each one of these curves is the recovery of each component. So this is for the first component, you get a higher recovery. This is for the second component. And on the x-axis, we have the weights W1 and W2. And, to Wahid's point about the proportionality of the weights, since we could change them by any constant and we still get the same result, we're just going to have them sum to 1 in this case. So if the two weights are half, then this would be what you have for vanilla PCA. You're not weighting any data any differently. And you can see you have quite suboptimal recovery. But then for inverse noise variance and the optimal weights that we have in our theorem, we get these curves over here. So now what are the different colors on these curves? So the orange dotted line is our asymptotic recovery equation that I showed a few slides ago. The blue ribbon is the interquartile interval, 25 to 75% of all of the synthetic runs, and the blue, heavy blue line is the mean. So you can see that even in this case where we only have 1,000 samples and 1,000 dimensions, it's actually pretty nicely concentrated and follows our asymptotic recovery result nicely. And then as we increase just by a factor of 10 here, so 10,000 samples and dimensions, we have extremely tight concentration already. So even in these pretty moderate size problems, optimizing that asymptotic recovery curve is also seeming to optimize the recovery curve in finite sample regime. Okay, so are there any questions about this weighted PCA approach?
For the coefficients that you get, I mean, the denominator looks suspiciously like that, sigma y inverse that you use in MMSE estimation. So is there some relationship between kind of the coefficients that these suggested weight design and some MMSE style intuition, or like a denoising sort of interpretation?
If there is, I would be very interested to explore it, because we've been trying to think about how to interpret it in that way, and we haven't found a good match yet. But are you saying that this particular, like these two terms, remind you of something that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, like if you have a Bayesian estimation of a Gaussian and Gaussian noise, you end up with this 1 over the received variance squared times, then it's multiplied usually by the signal variance squared. So that's it's a little bit different here. Like if I multiplied, it's kind of like the numerator is wrong, but the denominator looks right in some sense. And I wasn't sure if if you had any interpretation that way, but I guess maybe it's just similar formulas don't necessarily mean similar. Like, just because it looks the same doesn't mean it's the same.
That's true. But also I look forward to talking to you about it, when we talk this afternoon, because there's different ways of writing this, since we can have anything proportional to this. And so, I could share with you some of those other equations and we can see if it matches something more precisely.
Hey, could you just go back for a second?
Yeah.
This is like our I and L, like, could you just say what the difference is, like on the previous slide?
Yes.
You have the index I is a component, but the index L is a weight, and somehow they're
Yeah.
they're different.
Yeah. So actually here, let me go back up to, or even here. So L is the group. So, for each data point, now, denoted by J, then I'm going to have a specific weight for that data point, but I'm going to apply the same weight to every sensor or data point in that group. So that's what the L is.
Okay, and you know what these groups are beforehand. You know what like the high. Yeah. Okay.
I
Right.
could go
Thank
all
you.
the way back. That here we assume the membership of the groups are known, and we know how many there are. So that's another interesting thing that I will address in the next little section. And then I was the component of U. So I was referring to which principal component.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Okay. All right. So yeah, so now that I see I used I here, I was about to say, I hope I kept the notation same, but yeah, I'll fix that for the future. So now I'm going to consider this alternative probabilistic Pca approach, where each one of my data points is coming from a probabilistic model. I'm going to assume Z and epsilon are IID normal, but each column has a different noise variance. And in this section, instead of looking for those components U, I'm actually going to talk a little bit about estimating this matrix F, which is U times theta. You'll see some discussion of U and theta still, but overall, we talk about estimating F. Okay, so as a little review, in homoscedastic noise, meaning when all of the data have IID noise of a given variance, there's a formulation of probabilistic Pca, which takes the log likelihood of this model and basically rearranges until we see that the data only appears through the sample covariance matrix, okay? And in fact, we can then use the singular value decomposition of this sample covariance matrix in order to find the maximum likelihood, okay? And so this is, a classical result by now that in order to estimate this matrix F, the components times the amplitudes, then we just need the principal eigenvectors of the covariance matrix and then some shrunk eigenvalues, okay? So it's a very nice solution to what started out as a somewhat complicated looking non-convex problem, okay? But unfortunately, if you do have heteroskedasticity in your data, meaning different samples have different noise variance, then this probabilistic Pca approach degrades, okay? So in these four plots, I'm showing first the recovery of F. So this F tilde is the true one, and F hat is my estimated one, the one estimated with Pca. And in these three, I show recovery of three principal components because I'm assuming that my F tilde is rank 3, okay? And one of my groups has noise variance 1, whereas the other group has variance that's on this x-axis. So you can see when the noise variance is small, it gets a better recovery, but it very quickly degrades as the other group's noise variance deteriorates. Now, if I were to perform Pca only on the first group, this group with noise variance 1, I would get these green curves. So you can see when the second group variance gets really high, it's actually better to do Pca just on group 1. And on the flip side, if I only perform PPCA or the SVD with shrinkage on group 2, then in this regime here, I can do better. Okay, so our goal is to hopefully rederive a new probabilistic Pca approach that hopefully gets the best of all of these different scenarios. The challenge is the likelihood does not separate in the same way that it did for homoskedastic PPCA. And so we derived an EM algorithm to estimate F, the noise variances, and also some indicator, or these Z's here, sorry, not indicator, the weight vector Zi. Okay. So I want to get to this last part of my talk on variety completion, so I'm not going to go as carefully through this part. But this slide is just to say that we see that there's no closed form estimate for this F matrix, the factor matrix, and the noise variances eta. And in fact, even if we're given the noise variances, F is not closed form and vice versa, okay? So we decided to apply alternating Ascent algorithms to this problem. For the F update, we use EM, and for the update of the noise variances, we tried a variety of different techniques, root finding, EM, MM, and I'll show you some of those in a later slide. So if we use these approaches in order to estimate both the factor matrix and the noise variances, then we get a curve on these plots that looks like what we wanted. We see we can get an error that achieves the best of all worlds, is able to do as well as using Pca on any one of the groups in any one of these regimes. Okay. Now this slide is here to illustrate those different techniques for estimating the noise variances. Okay. What we have in the left plot is the convergence with respect to the likelihood. So I'm taking the optimal likelihood at convergence and subtracting the likelihood at each step. And you can see that in all cases it's going down. This is the black line is the root finding method, and it's the best in terms of iterations, but you can see, so each one of these dots is at, let's see, 5 iterations. So, it takes quite a bit longer to reach 5 iterations using root finding. It's just a slower algorithm. And then over here, we have convergence with respect to the factors. And another point that I wanted to make with these pictures is that what we see regularly in all of our different simulations is a convergence to the true factors and to some maximum likelihood value that is almost always achieved. So like Pca, it seems like this problem has a nice optimization landscape, and we're very interested in trying to explore that a little bit further. Okay, so the last really interesting experiment I wanted to share with you on this formulation of the problem is one where we try to estimate the factors and the noise variances even when we don't know which sample belongs to which group exactly, okay? So in this simulation, what we said was we'll have blocks of data, and we know those blocks belong to the same group, but we don't know how across blocks, how they're related to each other. And here we had 200 data samples at a low noise variance 1 and 800 data samples at a high noise variance 4. And you can see that even when we had a block size of 1, meaning that we estimated a different noise variance for every data sample, we didn't know which data sample would be grouped with any other data sample. We had a pretty good range of estimates for those noise variances, okay? In fact, there's kind of a separation between the two groups, and you could even imagine using these estimates to do some kind of clustering in order to try to identify the groups. Then as the block sizes increased, the noise variance estimate concentrated quite a bit. So, when we had block sizes of 100, we had very, very good estimate of the noise variance in each group. Okay, so in conclusion for this part, we talked about a couple of different methods for PCA with heteroskedastic data. And as I mentioned, we're interested in understanding the optimization landscape. It seems nice. We want to be able to say something about it. And perhaps analyzing the maximum likelihood approach in the same high dimensional setting. So before I go to the next section, are there any questions? Okay, I just have a few minutes to talk on this next section. So let me just give you the high level overview. First, these are my collaborators for this work. Greg Anji, who's a first-year assistant professor at Marquette now, but was my postdoc when we started this work. Rob Nowak, Daniel Pimentel at Wisconsin, and Rebecca Willett, who's at the University of Chicago. So matrix completion is a problem where you have a matrix for your data, your data storage, and there's several entries that you have that are missing. This is just an illustration of that from some environmental data that I've worked with. And in general, the idea is that given an incomplete matrix, you're going to assume some functional relationship among the entries and try to use that relationship in order to just impute all the missing entries. So low rank matrix completion is now more than 10 years old and has assumed that your underlying matrix has a linear structure that I mentioned before. And the generalization that we considered was where each column of your data matrix, instead of lying on a low dimensional linear variety, lies on a nonlinear variety. So the definition of an algebraic variety is just the solution of a set of polynomial equations, okay? Certainly if those equations are linear, then you get a subspace or a linear variety, but this is then a generalization to nonlinear setting, okay? There's a lot of really interesting models that fit into nonlinear algebraic varieties. One of them is the union of subspaces, which is extremely applicable in many really interesting problems. Okay, and here's the high-level slide. What we discovered, and one of the key findings of our work, is to say, if you have your original matrix that lies on some low-dimensional nonlinear variety, and you tensorize it using some polynomial lifting kernel, so in this case, all degree 2 monomials, then it turns out that this lifted matrix is rank deficient when the columns of the original matrix belong to a proper algebraic variety, okay? So this matrix has linear low rank. And so the idea of our algorithm then is to use matrix completion for linear low rank matrices in this domain, in this lifted domain, do the matrix completion and then find a way to get back to the original space. Okay, there are a lot of challenges in considering an algorithm like this. First, we needed to show that the variety have a low rank representation in this lifted space. But even more challenging, and what we did in our recent work here, was to show that the completion is unique, even though you have this tensorized sampling pattern and a lack of incoherence assumptions. So up here in this space, we can't make the standard assumptions that people do for low rank matrix completion. But we tackled those challenges in our recent work. And the last challenge that we have yet to tackle is to show that any given algorithm actually finds that unique completion. So that we see it happens empirically, but we haven't been able to show that part yet. Okay, so this part would take a second to get into, but let me just tell you that the theory we have here says that for a union of subspaces, you need approximately root k, where k is the number of clusters or number of subspaces, times r, number of samples in every column, in order to have unique matrix completion be possible, meaning in order for identifiability to hold. And in fact, it's not possible, at least using the quadratic representation, if m is smaller than that number. We have some experiments on synthetic data and real data where we saw our algorithms outperform standard and low rank matrix completion techniques by a little bit. So capturing some of the interesting nonlinearity and using it for matrix completion. Okay, so one last plug. This last paper that I talked about will soon be published in the SIAM Journal of Mathematics of Data Science. And I just wanted to let people know about it since it's a new journal. I'm an associate editor. I'd be very excited to see your papers submitted and hopefully be able to handle those papers for SIAM, for SIMONs. Okay, thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take more questions.
Thank you so much, Laura, for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.
With a virtual applause, thank Laura. And we have time for a few questions.
Can I ask a question? Yeah, this is Jie from computer science. I was thinking while you're presenting that Pca is not very robust to noise. I'm thinking if we are aware of the noise that was introduced in the data, for example, in data sanitization, sometimes for privacy protection, you perturb the data with some noise, right? Gaussian noise or Laplace noise. If
Right.
you are aware of that noise introduced in the data, and later you want to run Pca on top of it to discover the structure, what is the best known solution for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the perturbation is like engineered,
Right.
by some privacy.
Someone else, right?
Yeah. I mean, there is work on private Pca. Pca in general is like you can think of as kind of an aggregation technique, right? You can't necessarily discover individual entries of a matrix just by knowing its principal components. But it's an interesting question. I guess what I mean to say is I'm sure somebody has thought about the answer for particular noise models. I mean, certainly if you just perturbed with Gaussian noise, then you would just use Pca. If you perturb with Gaussian independent identically distributed noise, then vanilla Pca would give you the best estimate. We know that. But presumably in privacy techniques, they might use some other types of perturbations. So it's an interesting question. I don't know the answer, but thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Other questions?
I guess I have one more question. Maybe about this last thing with the algebraic varieties. Is this lifting operation that you're talking about, is that at all related to, something simpler, like doing, like if I want to, I mean, you're saying you're gonna essentially plug in all degree 2 monomials, right? But that's sort of the trick that you do when you want to fit a quadratic to data. You also take your x and find all monomials. So is that the same? Is that sort of like a generalization of that trick, or completely different?
No, it's the same. It's the same trick. So here we're using degree, in this case, degree 2 polynomials, but in our work in general, we just talk about, using degree p lifting. So it's just a polynomial kernel that you're using and lifting to that space. And I guess the key result that we have is that if your data originally are in an algebraic variety, regardless of the polynomial degree of that variety, then when you lift it to this space, it's linear low rank.
And is the degree that you have to lift, I mean,
you can use any
degree of the lifting is the degree of the variety, or?
No, it doesn't have to be the same. So that's the key interesting fact, is that when you do this lifting, then you're gonna get something that's strictly low rank, as long as this is a proper variety, meaning it's a proper subset of the space. Now, of course, it may not be very low rank, right? So there's this other question of like, how low rank does it get? And we know that if your polynomial degree matches something about the variety, then you're going to get lower and lower rank. But what we showed with union of subspaces is that, even just this degree 2 polynomial, even though the variety polynomial degree is much higher, then it has a nice low rank.
Okay, cool. Really cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question.
Well, since we are at the top of the hour, I'll say we'll conclude it here. If people have questions, I'm sure Laura will be happy to address them over email. So I'll conclude by thanking Laura one more time for the wonderful talk. And thank you all for attending. That concludes our seminar.